This week, we're jumping into Consultants Corner, which is our weekly deep dive into stuff that we're seeing in our work, questions that come up in our community, and topics that you want us to discuss on the show. And this week, we have a question from the community. The question is, we've always allowed people to use makeup time, but I'm hearing conflicting news about whether it's lawful. Can you help? So, Summer, can you tackle this topic and bring us all up to speed on what is makeup time and if it's legal, and if so, for who?
I will absolutely do my best. So, if there's anything that maybe I skip over or need to go into more detail on, Joey, please do chime in. But I'm going to try to keep this simple because I think that it can get confusing very quickly. And as usual, I like to always give the disclaimer that individual states can have different versions of this. So, as you know, many of our prior listeners probably know, I'm actually physically located in California. We do serve clients across the US, but California has very specific rules in regards to makeup time. For non exempt employees, so let's start there, it allows them to take time off and make it up in the same work week. Okay, so that's the simplest concept of what makeup time is. And in states where there is no daily overtime, so to kind of break this down a little further, California has daily and weekly overtime. So if you work more than 8 hours in a day, it counts as overtime. If you work more than 40 hours in a week, everything over 40 counts as overtime. And so that's kind of why I was saying, check your individual state's requirements. But in a state where there's no daily overtime, it's pretty easy. So essentially, the employee can plan to make up time within that week that they would be missing otherwise, right? And if there's only weekly overtime, then there's no problem in doing so as long as they don't go over 40 hours. So I'm going to kind of stop there and say, what else do you think we should chat about or explain in regards to makeup time and maybe some of the most common areas of confusion surrounding it?
Yeah, I think we're going to dive into the areas of confusion. I think a practical example of that makeup time is, hey, I've got a late start because I have to take my kid to the doctor's office. So instead of coming in at 9, I'm going to come in at 11:30, and I'll make up time throughout the week. Or hey, we've got a long day. We've got an 11-hour day. There's a client coming into town and we want to take them to dinner, and that you're on the clock. So we'll allow you to make up, or we'll comp that time where you worked 11-hour days, and you'll get, 3 hours off another day or something like that. Those are some of the ways that we see comp time and making up time. So now we can get into the fun issues that we see.
Absolutely. So I mentioned California a little bit earlier, and I'm going to start with issues in California. And then I think maybe, Joey, you can chat about, or I can chat about, whichever you prefer, some of the other issues. In California, they are very, very specific of how makeup time works. As I mentioned, it's primarily because there is daily overtime as well. So you can only imagine that if an employee is working 10 hours in one day, it would typically mean that there's 2 hours of overtime. So if they're going to work that and it not count as overtime, there's a lot of rules to play by. So that's kind of the background of why it exists. So in California, those very specific rules to follow are this. Number one, the request for makeup time must be in writing in advance. And that's super clear. So, in other words, if I know that I'm going to miss time on Wednesday for 2 hours and I'd like to make that time up, it has to be within the same work week. So, I need to put it in writing and I need to submit that request before I miss the time. You can't do it after the fact. And then some of the other small rules are that even when you're working makeup time, it can't be you can't work more than 11 hours in a day or 40 hours in the week. So those are just kind of some important rules to follow. If you don't follow these, you run some very large risks for not paying overtime appropriately. And that's a very, very scary place to be. So I think the takeaway here is that if you are in California and you're allowing your employees to do makeup time, ensure that you have the proper documentation and process in place. California, it's really easy to trip up and make mistakes in this area, but I think there's probably a couple other like issues or problems that we could chat about as well. Joey, do you have another one?
Yeah, I just want to throw in another monkey wrench for the great state of California, where there's actually such a thing as double time, uh, double time overtime. If an individual works more than 12 hours in a workday or more than 8 hours on their seventh consecutive workday. So if you're, I don't know, accounting firm and it's tax season and you've got folks working 8 days straight or 7 days straight, you might trigger double time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very rare that we talk about some of these things, but they are laws on the books and they do exist. And so if you have employees in California, or you're looking to branch into California, you've got to pay attention to some of these things.
Oh, I feel like we could probably do a week of California episodes for sure. But one of the other items that I wanted to chat about in regards to this topic is a question in regards to exempt employees, because we've talked a little bit about non exempt employees and what that means for makeup time. But sometimes we also get questions about makeup time for exempt employees. So, ready to talk about that one?
Yeah, I am. And this is where a lot of non HR folks get confused about what these terms even mean. And to be honest, sometimes even HR folks can get confused. So when you are exempt, that means you are exempt from overtime. Typically, that means you are a salaried professional, a qualified salaried professional, and your payment is based on an annual wages and not so much an hourly rate. When you are non-exempt, that means you are not exempt from overtime, and typically your wages are calculated by the hourly rate. Even though that may roll up into an annual wage for the purpose of like an offer letter or in a payroll system, but the difference between exempt and non-exempt is basically if you cross that threshold of that 8th hour in the day or that 40th hour in the work week, is there such a thing as additional compensation? So hopefully that catches us all up to speed. Summer, go ahead and I'll pass the baton to you for the next part of that conversation as far as overtime laws for non-exempt folks.
Sure thing. I was thinking that one of the most important points that I wanted to chat about in regards to these individuals that are exempt from overtime is, kind of this concept of makeup time, because I think there's a lot of confusion around it. And I've seen companies create their own processes that aren't really best practice. And in my opinion, do create kind of some different risk that the way that I explain it to them is treating their exempt employees like hourly employees. And some of the practices that they put in place, I think, blur the line as to whether they are exempt or non exempt. And so, kind of taking an exempt employee and kind of creating this concept of makeup time really shouldn't exist, because if you think about the nature of how exempt employees are paid, I explain it like this: you're paying them to do a job. You're not paying them based on the amount of time it takes them to do the job. So yes, while part of the job may be we need you to be available during our regular business hours, and that kind of has time associated with it, it's really the job itself. Now, if their job is more based on deliverables and say they're able to finish their job in fewer than the expected hours that day, then you're not going to pay them less. But on the flip side, if they takes them 10 hours or maybe 12 hours to do their job every day, like that's the job they're being paid for. So while I know it doesn't sound warm and fuzzy, just because you are exempt and you're working more than 8 hours in a day doesn't mean that you're entitled to additional time off. So I just wanted to mention some of the things that I have seen companies do in this regard that I think are the safe space to play in. And then certainly I'd love to hear ideas that you have. But typically what I see is for um, consistent schedule based positions. So most of your corporate type jobs, if they're working a consistent schedule, but maybe you ask them to work on what would typically be their day off, then we're not going to give them makeup time per se, but you would work with that employee to coordinate what would be a reasonable alternative so that they are getting the time off. But there shouldn't be like an official accounting of this. It'd be like, hey, Joey, I really appreciate you working on Saturday. I know that's your family day. So why don't you plan on taking another day off during next week? And we'll consider it, we'll consider that your day off that you should have received. But that's how I typically see it happening. Like there shouldn't be a formal accounting of how much time that exempt employee missed, how much they're due. Like that's like super dangerous.
Yeah, and I've actually seen that danger where employees will actually start to account and amass comp time, and they'll save it for a rainy day, so to speak, and attempt to cash in when it's time to go to HR, and it's like, well, we don't have a labor category for comp time, so what is this? And there's also the danger of doing your reconciliation in another pay period. So, for example, folks who will say, oh, well, take that extra time off on Monday when you know that Monday is the next pay period. It's probably better to say, hey, if you're working late on Friday, you should take that time off on the Thursday preceding that Friday so that your accounting of everything is safe.
Yeah, that's a really, really great tip. And so I think I'll leave our listeners and you, Joey, with a real quick story of where I've seen this play out in real life when it's not done properly, and the danger that came of it, so that hopefully, if others are maybe not quite on track with their current practice or policies, they understand the importance of getting this straight right away. But there was a company whose name I will leave unnamed, had salaried, so in kind of referring back to the terminology that we were using previously, an exempt employee who had been essentially challenging whether he was classified properly and was kind of making his case for that he should be non exempt, and had been keeping an accounting of all of the time that he had been working over 8 hours in a day. And I think that there was kind of this challenge within this specific location where they were um, kind of doing this makeup time, but with accounting. And when he became unhappy with his work situation, he used all of that accounting to say, I've been misclassified. Here's all of the hours that I'm now due back pay for overtime. And if you don't pay it, then we're going to go to court and sort this out.
Wow. So how did that turn out?
That one was resolved out of court. Certainly because there were many other individuals in this position in different locations that certainly if it became public knowledge, then there was a concern that it would become a much larger issue and the company didn't want to take that risk.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen that in healthcare agency where because in healthcare in certain states the overtime laws are different, and so if you have an ambitious doctor who opens up a practice and they don't know the HR law around labor and overtime and meal and rest periods, you run the risk of having tons of people on your staff all doing the same thing that's wrong, and you ultimately have to either settle it before the government gets involved
Yeah.
or settle it after the government gets involved.